of Saad Hariri, supposedly pro-Western element, resigned, which means he's been replaced by a guy called Hassan Diab, who is in essence a puppet, an appointee of Hezbollah. It means that today, more than any time, in the last 3 months, more than at any time since Hezbollah's establishment by the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps in 1982, today, more than at any time in that whole period, Iran is now overtly in control of the official mechanisms of government inside Lebanon. What does that mean? It means that Hezbollah and its allies have a majority in the parliament. It means that Hezbollah and its allies are the entirety of the cabinet. Hezbollah controls 3 out of the 4 intelligence services in Lebanon. Hezbollah is strong in the economy of Lebanon, and it's got its talons deep into the army as well, and it controls elements also of the Lebanese military. So more than at any time in the past, the Iranian domination of Lebanon is overt and near complete. That then is really the extent of the situation. So in Iraq, Iran is dominant, but there are still powerful forces arrayed against it. In Syria, Iran is not dominant, but it controls important areas of the country more or less exclusively. And in Lebanon, Iran has more or less completed the project to the extent that Lebanon today is a more or less fully hollowed out shell into which the Islamic Revolutionary Guards has inserted itself. That's the challenge, I would say, probably the key security challenge today facing Israeli strategists and policymakers, and I look forward to discussing that in greater detail and listening to my colleagues in the minutes ahead. Thanks very much.
You know, because you were so disciplined in time, and I'm sure we're going to go back to this, but I'm curious if I can tease that out, and we'll go back to the others in this question, and do ask you, if you could give general strokes, given the Iranian entrenchment everywhere in the region, what is the Israeli strategy to address it? And I mean, we're here in the presence of representatives of the U.S., of organizations in the U.S. How does this fit in with U.S. policy? And I know we're going to touch on Iran, but what are we talking about the proxies?
Yes. Well, first of all, in the space which I was discussing, it's crucial to understand you can't separate Israeli policy from U.S. policy. U.S. policy can only work if Israel's part of it, and the reverse is also true. What does that mean in practice? Israel has no interest or involvement in the deeper political arrangements of any of these countries, and Israel's not going to go near it. What Israel has been doing and will continue to do is to, in a kinetic way, take down the head of the snake, so to speak, the more overt movement of weapons systems and attempts to entrench bases and base weaponry close to the border. These will be dealt with and are being dealt with by the Israeli Air Force, Special Forces, and intelligence, sometimes in a visible way, sometimes in an invisible way. That's going to continue. But that only makes sense and can only be successful, in my view, if there's a broader US policy, which is currently, I think, in the process of emerging, but we're getting there, so to speak. And that policy, first and foremost, has to be to understand that the government in Lebanon, the official government, and the government in Iraq are not allies of the United States and should not be treated as allies of the United States. They should be treated today as governments which are hostile to the United States. What does that mean in practice? It means, for example, in Iraq, the United States has just renewed for 45 days a waiver to the Iraqi government to allow them to buy Iranian gas, right, to be outside of the sanctions against Iran. These kind of measures need to stop. It needs to be understood. This government in Baghdad is a hostile government. It's a government dominated by the Iranians. There are many allies available in Iraq. The Kurdish forces are one. There are elements in the Sunni community as well. These alliances need to be developed. What needs to take place between America and Israel is a full court effort, both political and military and paramilitary, and when possible or necessary, in order to roll back the Iranian advance of the last 20, 30 years. There are many allies on the ground. The Iranians are not that strong. They're strong and very good at certain things. At proxy warfare, they're excellent. But when it comes to economic activity, when it comes to air warfare, when it comes to intelligence, we're much better at all that than they are. So what needs to happen is that the extent of the challenge needs to be understood. We need to stop taking shortcuts and thinking that people are friends who are not friends, and then we need to begin to act in a determined way against the enemies in this arena.
We'll go back to this. I'm just going to say that from where I sit, and the RAND Corporation, we work primarily for the Defense Department, and I think there is a difference. There's clearly convergence of U.S. and Israeli interests and policies when it comes to Syria, and you can argue also that Israel has shouldered the burden for the United States in Syria, trying to roll back the Iranian influence. I think in Iraq, we're talking about a different story. You can say about maybe there is a policy in the US, but when you talk about the White House, it's very different from the Pentagon. Israeli airstrikes, according to foreign press, in Iraq are not welcomed by the Pentagon. And this is something I think we need to talk about, the convergence of, and how do you keep, given where we're talking about the convergence of Israeli and US interest, and how we make sure we deconflict those two. Thank you, though. But I appreciate your distinction between is the maximum pressure strategy working now and the prospect for success, because, I mean, there's no question it's taking a toll on the Iranian economy. And yeah, the New York Times reported that the militias in Lebanon and Syria, are hit a little bit, but Jonathan Spyer just told us about Iranian entrenchment in Yemen and Iraq, and from my perspective, what we want to see is a change in Iranians' policies and behavior, not suffering of the people, the economy, right? And we haven't seen that yet.
Well, okay. Well, of course, you're right. There is a distinction between the two, but it can't happen without some form of pressure on them. I mean, it's impossible to roll back. As I said, the point is rolling back their gains. What Jonathan Spyer described is sort of, that land bridge to the Mediterranean in which, by one means or another, Iran has control. The means to deny them that control must be primarily, it must start with economic measures and to put enough pressure on them that they feel the pressure at home. And yes, of course, the fact that they're short of money doesn't mean that the militias aren't still there, that they're still not armed, that they're still not willing to exert their power. But absent economic pressure, I'm not sure what is the proposal. At that point, then you really do get into the war or appeasement choice, in which case, well, then the West is likely to choose appeasement rather than getting involved in Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq, and also taking Iran. So yes, maximum pressure is the start, but it's a necessary start, at least it seems to me, if you're going to do anything about this regional situation in which Iran does. I mean, this talk of regional hegemony is no longer entirely a boast. It's a reality.
Thank you. We'll go back to Iran later. I do want to move to, Micky's not just going to talk about Russia, but primarily Russia's perspective, Russia's interest in this region, Russia's policies as they reflect in their policy, Russia's Middle East policies, but it's always a reflection of Russia's bigger policies, right, vis-a-vis the United States and the West. So please, Micky.
Thank you. Can you hear me? I wanted to start by frightening you and saying Russians are coming, but I cannot because they are already here. They're already all over the Middle East. Syria is, of course, the obvious case, but they're also in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Libya, in Sudan, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulfies. They are also very much present in Africa because, as opposed to the US, Russia is acquiring foothold without preconditions in terms of human rights and so on before forwarding or increasing aid, signing defense deals and so on. Russian perception is one of a zero-sum game when it comes to the US. If the US is not interested, Russia will pour in. Russia is taking advantages of opportunities in the Middle East, signing defense contracts with Egypt, for example. 2013, the US refused to sign defense deals with Egypt because General Assisi, who came to power, did it in a military coup. Now, I'm reminding you, he removed from power not Mother Teresa, but the Muslim Brothers. But still, Russians, of course, poured right in and signed billions of dollars defense deals with Egypt. There is an old Russian saying, a chauvinist Russian saying, that the one who buys a lady dinner gets to dance with her. And everybody who is not enjoying an American dinner is dancing with the Russians in the Middle East. Russia is far weaker than the US. If you compare defense budgets, I think Russian defense budget is about 1/10 of the one of the US. But the Russians are not bothered with any ideology, are not bothered with any human rights issues. Now, since the Arab Spring, every event is examined individually in Russia and according to the opportunities it offers. So Russia can maneuver between religious and ideological rivals like Saudi Arabia and Iran, and it can sell to everybody. We're talking about hotspots in the Middle East. A hotspot or a hot topic is the refugee issue. It is very instrumental for Russia for creating the equation, more stability and more prosperity in Syria, less refugees go to the West. Russia is using this issue as a leverage with the West. Now, Russia itself is not influenced terribly with the refugee issue. Total from 2015, since Russia got involved in the war, there were 2,500 refugees coming to Russia. And out of all of them, one received a refugee status. So it's not a big issue internally in Russia. Russian influence is measured in Russian eyes in cost and benefit. Syria is a very good example. Russian cost for its operation in Syria is extremely low. There's very small investment. They're using the training budget of the army. They simply train the army in Syria instead of training it in Russia, for example. Now, while in the US, war is bad for business, as President Trump says, in Russia, war is very good for business, especially for the defense industries that are Putin's support base and are the #2 source of income in Russia after the gas and oil industry. More than 240 weapon systems, Russian weapon systems, were tested in Syria by the Russians, and they're not saying, their defense industries are not using the slogan, tested in battle anymore. They're saying, tested in Syria. If these don't work, by the way, the Russians either blame differences in weather, or they say it's the Syrians who are incapable of operating the defense systems. Therefore, we see a lot of clients coming back to Russia after they left Russia in 1991, the Soviet Union. There's also no electoral cost for the Russian leadership in operating in the Middle East. There's no pressure like in the US. In the US, they say, bring the boys back home. In Russia, there's no bring boys back home. There is, bring us back the pride we lost and the humiliation, after the humiliation we suffered in the loss in the Cold War. States in the Middle East take advantage of Russia's growing presence in the Middle East and the Russia-US competition. Saudi Arabia, for example, after the Khashoggi affair, the slaughtered Saudi journalist, so the US threatened Saudi Arabia with sanctions. Saudi Arabia came out in the press and said, you know what, if you're going to sanction us, we're going to let the Russians open a military base in Saudi Arabia. Have you heard of a sanction against Saudi Arabia in the US? I think not, so far. Russia portrays the logic that if you create a chaos, and they give the example of Iraq or Libya, it may spill over to other states. And I believe that pro-Western states like Saudi Arabia and Jordan, see eye to eye with Russians in that sense, although they have to pay a lip service to the US in the fear of being cut from aid and so on. Popular support for Russia in the Middle East is on the rise because of Russian willingness to be boots on the ground and proving long-lasting loyalty to their allies like Assad, as opposed to the US. I'm thinking about Mubarak in Egypt. They're willing to do, Russia is willing to do whatever it takes to assist their ally and reach victory. And when I say whatever it takes, it is also like bombing schools and hospitals on purpose. Russia doesn't apologize, and unlike the US, there is no cost. Russia's view is global. Russia is looking for a deal with the US, and if it can reach understandings on the Ukraine, for example, it is willing to be more cooperative in the Middle East, let's say in Syria. However, the chances for a deal with the US are very, very low. there is complete misunderstanding in US government of Russia of the required sticks and of the required carrots. There's misunderstanding of the sanctions and their impact. There's misunderstanding of the stamina of the Russian people. And the fact that Putin is making the Russian people proud again after many years. Supporting Putin was at its height when he invaded Ukraine. Speaking about hotspots in general in the Middle East, Russia wants to increase its posture as a superpower by serving as a mediator. In conflict zones, it doesn't create conflicts. The Middle East is perfectly capable of creating its own conflicts, but it is definitely exploiting them. And therefore, it wishes to be in good relations with everybody, to be in a unique position for mediating. In particular, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Russia aspires very much to mediate. I remember in my years in office, there wasn't a single meeting with senior Russians. We did not receive an offer for hosting a conference between Israelis and Palestinians in Moscow. We never replied. If Russia feels it is out of the game, it is not involved in some sort of process of mediating, like what happened in Manama in Bahrain, Russia was not part of Manama, then Russia pursues a narrative that says that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the source of all evil in the Middle East. That is like the Arab Spring or the Arab Winter never was. And Israel, and until Israel and the Palestinians resolve their conflict, radicalism will be on the rise in the Middle East. This is Russian narrative. Russia today serves as the main source of declaratory support for the Palestinians, mainly because of their interests with Arab states, because of their Muslim population, and because they want to spoil it for the US. Russia declared it is opposed to the deal of the century only after it made sure Arab states declared they are against it. When it comes to Israel in particular, it is a relationship of pragmatism. Russians don't want to be sentimental, the Israelis cannot afford to be sentimental, and we have to take Russia into account. Russia is critical for operating in the Middle East, and how do we get it to cooperate? First of all, by showing respect, by paying, if you remember Nama Issachar case, and by proving that Israel is capable to use its technologies and to put its money where its mouth is. Russia knows that Israel, to an extent, can make or break Russian plans in Syria. Its main goal is Its main goal is to stabilize Syria and to bring prosperity to the Assad regime. I conclude by saying that it is doubtful whether Russia can be as involved like it is in Syria elsewhere, but I also think that there is great doubt if you see any spot in the Middle East in the near future without Russian involvement. Thank you.
I do want to open it to your questions, and how does it work? Do you line up, or? Yeah, okay. But maybe I'll ask one question. I'll ask Micky that ties the three arenas. Of course, Israel doesn't have a choice. It has to cooperate with Russia or maybe deconflict with Russia. We just don't have a choice.
Exactly.
According to multiple conversations I've had with US decision makers, the defense establishment in Israel, we know that Israel has requested and agreed with Russia that Russia would distance the Iranians from the Israeli border around 80 kilometers. And there's a sense that they're not doing that. And my question to you, is it lack of willingness on their part or lack of ability?
Well, they're doing it to an extent. Russia cannot just flip a finger and kick Iran out of Syria, but it has enough leverages to distance Iran from the Israeli border. However, it will not do it for free. The Russian security apparatus is growingly feeling that Israel is enjoying free lunch. They sense that they are, I'm not sure allowing is the word, but to operate in Syria, and they're doing Israel favors, and Israel is not paying them back. A Russian colleague told me that Jerusalem is Moscow's emergency line to Washington. That is, they have high expectations from Israel when it comes to lobbying or opening the door in Washington. And I think it's a terrible burden, because if we do not do that, Russia feels, again, we're enjoying a free lunch. And I think there are limits to how long they're willing to offer that lunch.
Thank you. So we will take questions. If it'd be nice if you just introduce yourself by name and affiliation.
Hi, Robbie Herskowitz, the spouse of Johanna, who's the president of Amuna.
Oh, wow.
What I didn't hear was Iran's nuclear weapon program. How close are they to actually making the nuclear weapon? And in the event that they are close or they actually make it, I would assume that that is a changing point all over. And would Russia, you know, at that point, would Russia allow, whether it's America, whether it's Saudi Arabia, whether it's Israel, to go in without them stepping in between to stop anything?
Maybe they should ask who they're asking the question to.
Yeah, who would you?
It was an
Jonathan
open, I
Spyer?
guess, to you about the nuclear weapon, or if anyone has a better idea of how far
Yeah.
they are from developing it, and then I guess
Then
you're the
Russia.
Russian expert.
Right. So how about we start with, we'll just go by the order of the way you spoke.
Okay, well, as far as I'm aware, with regard to how far they are from a nuclear weapon, the Israeli assessment, if I'm not mistaken, is 2 years. That it would take them, if they were to take the decision tomorrow, it would take them 2 years. Not 2 years to get to the level of uranium enrichment that they would need. They could do that much quicker. But the technical element of making the uranium fit on a warhead and having a launchable missile, the assumption is around 2 years, if I'm not mistaken.
I would say if Iran goes down that road, the risk it's taking, which is, I think, a very real risk, is that it's recreating the pre-2013 coalition against them. Because as much as Europe derides the Trump administration's stance on Iran and pulling out of the deal, that argument evaporates in the face of a breakout or an attempt to break out to a nuclear weapon. My instinct on that is that that is a real deterrent to Iran. They do not want to face a united world. They certainly don't want to put themselves in a position where they actually do have to fight a military conflict that they have no desire to fight. They want to fight proxy wars. They want their terrorist auxiliaries throughout the Middle East to exert semi or complete control over various countries. They want the IRGC to have full reign. They do not want to fight a war over a nuclear weapon. Certainly it's a sense of national pride. It doesn't want to make concessions, but there are limits. And frankly, the Iranian regime has shown a degree of sort of common sense about how far to go. They're very good at negotiating. They certainly got President Obama and John Kerry to more or less give them what they wanted in a deal. Some might argue that, but I think that's a fair conclusion. But if they're going to blow up the deal, even the remnants of it, they're facing a real situation. And I'll wait to hear a Russia expert, but I don't think they have great hopes of being saved by Russia and China if they really do force the United States and Europe to start thinking about things that they don't want to contemplate.
Can I just, before we come to Micky, just to come back on that, I mean, I very much agree with what Jonathan's saying. I think that this is something we sometimes don't get clear enough in our minds when we're looking at Iran. Of course, Iran has the nuclear ambition. This is a real ambition. But Iran is very busy with something else. Iran is busy with advancing its interests inside the region, and it's doing very well at that. It's moving forward. And one of the ways to ruin that, right, would be to provoke, as Jonathan said, would be to provoke a conflict. Then all that project would end if Iran upsets its enemies too much. So it's in Iran's interest not to do that, and that applies to the nuclear file, and I would say it also very probably applies to the response for the killing of General Soleimani. Right? They'll think very carefully, and they have thought very carefully, I think, about calibrating that to a level just below the point which would provoke the kind of reaction which could do real damage to their long-term project, which they're doing very well putting together and advancing on right now.
You know, Putin called Israel a Russian-speaking state. There are 1.5 million comers from Russia. And whenever we discussed Iran in a meeting with Russia, which was in every meeting, the Iranians used to say, you know, you have to rely on us. We will never let any harm come from Iran to the sons of the homeland, those who come from Russia, like myself. Thank you, I prefer to rely on the IDF. But they are operating according to their interests. They are calculating risks all the time. They are not able to face the US, really. But they're waiting for a deal. And I think the Iranians know that. They know that if the Russians get a good enough deal, they will follow it, just as they follow the sanctions under JCPOA. But there's not a good enough deal on the table yet.
Maybe I'll just add the Chinese perspective, because I think there's also this assumption that you know, China and Iran are linked. So, and China's motivation and interest in the region it's energy dependent, and Iran is its primary provider. But it's really, we're not seeing that, and it's not in China's interest, and no one wants Iran to have nuclear weapons on the international community. And it's not just Iran, right? What do you start with? The whole region will have nuclear weapons. So I think hopefully we will not get to that scenario that was depicted in the question.
The Shah regime basically fell when the military decided that they didn't want to shoot on the civilians. Now there are reports that while the upper echelon of the military is being taken care of, 150,000 of the lower class, if you will, are unable to be paid, and they're being landed instead of actually being paid. That's the question number one. The other one is to you. You said rightfully that the Iranians are waiting for Trump administration to pass. Now, there are also reports that they are waiting to get closer to the election, and they create some kind of a lower aggression, so confront the president either to look weak or to do something. Either way, it would affect his re-election.
Well, in the United States, we talk a lot about foreign powers intervening in our election. We don't talk a lot about Iran intervening in the election. But you're right. It could stage some sort of provocation. I think, however, they ought to be very cautious about that, because an attack on the United States in some way or form is probably more likely to help Trump than to hurt him. I mean, I'm just guessing there. Certainly, Trump doesn't want a war. He doesn't want to fight a war. But he'd be perfectly happy to do something, as with Soleimani, to sort of pound his chest and say that the United States won't be pushed around. I think you in terms of what's going on in Iran, you point to something, it's an iron law of history that tyrannical regimes
Makers should concentrate on is not the intelligence failure. I'm not sure there was a failure. I'm not sure it wasn't maybe technical, but the response, because it is translated into perceiving American deterrence as non-existent or weak, and not just by the Iranians, by the Russians and by others. And the accumulating events in which the US did not respond, I think cost a very high price for US deterrence in the region. And it's heard everywhere. It's heard in the Kremlin, it's heard in other countries.
Yeah, just to add to the technical aspects, you could talk about Aramco, but the previous attacks on tankers, it's equivalent to lone wolf stuff. There's stuff that technically you can't really predict, detect in real time. Aramco was a different story, and it's been under clearly there are eyes and ears everywhere there. So why wasn't it foreseen? This is a question, but I'm actually I think when the U.S. president said for a long time that he doesn't want to interfere in the Middle East, we should listen to the U.S. president. When people expected after Aramco that the U.S. would respond, I told colleagues in Israel they're crazy. But there were two things that brought the Soleimani response, which was a response that wanted to signal something. First of all, an American person died. And you kill an American, you're dead. Maybe not immediately, maybe in a few years, but that's it. There is a red line on that. And the second thing is to reestablish the deterrence that you both spoke about. And who knows, it's short term, but maybe it's working, hopefully.
Vernon Kurtz. As you do your sweep across Iran, Iraq, right to the borders here, and as from Russia and involved with Syria, et cetera, there's one country that I'd like you to all three comment on, and that's Turkey. Where do we find Turkey in all of this mix? And I think that's critical for our understanding of the entire region at this point.
Shall I start? I mean,
Anybody who wants it. I think it relates to the
No,
Russian,
you're
it clearly
right.
relates to Iran and the sweep across the region.
Right. Mickey, if you can also explain on, it's in the context of Syria, but also in Libya and
One of Russia's methods is divide and conquer, and they're trying to divide the West, divide NATO. And it is a great achievement for Putin, the fact that he is getting closer to Turkey. They're selling them something as a substitute for the F-35 that the US refused to sell after Turkey decided to buy Russian defense systems. And again, we see what is happening right now in Syria, and I think if somebody thinks there's going to be a clash between Russia and Turkey, don't hold your breath. Both sides are calculating their risks, and I think Erdogan would think twice, at least, before trying to provoke Putin. And again, I think Turkey may serve as the most, Turkey right now is one of the dangers, the biggest dangers for Israeli national security in the region. I don't think we have time to elaborate on this. We've written in JISS about it, and you're welcome to get a copy, but it should definitely get more attention, I think, in our discussions.
I think your question points to something I think that most of us have acknowledged about the Trump administration, or about President Trump's approach to foreign policy since he was running first in 2015. There's a basic contradiction between his worldview about the United States and the Middle East and his sort of tactical feelings about some conflicts. Trump campaigned as the guy who was not going to get the US into foreign wars, and who didn't want to do nation building, didn't want to repeat the mistakes of all of his predecessors. And that was a popular message, whether all the foreign policy establishment or even the pro-Israel camp liked it. On the other hand, he also campaigned as the guy who was going to beat ISIS, which Obama didn't. He was going to destroy them, which Obama failed to do, and he was going to be tough on Iran. There's a basic contradiction between those two impulses. And the history of the foreign policy of the last 3 years in terms of the United States has been the navigation between those two instincts. On Iran, he's been fairly consistent in terms of his instinct that the nuclear deal was a mistake, sanctions had to be reimposed, and economic pressure put on it to get a better nuclear deal or to restrain Iran without being sucked into war. On Syria, he's certainly, by sort of removing restraints on the U.S. military and the allies, he achieved results that even certainly the Obama administration alumni say, well, the strategy was in place. The victory happened on his watch. And yet he's also soft on Russia and soft on Turkey. He doesn't connect those dots. And also, he just doesn't want to create conflicts unless a conflict is pushed into his face where he can't avoid it. Turkey's a bad actor. Turkey is no ally to the United States, let alone a reliable NATO ally. But the Trump administration figures it's got enough conflicts on its hands as it is. So it tries to paper these things over, it tries to maintain or at least sort of manage a bad relationship. Is that a viable long-term strategy? I would say no. But that is a good short-term strategy, at least in terms of managing that basic contradiction.
I think it's a really important point, and Jonathan, but it's also important to mention that there's a personality involved in those issues, and there's real respect in the White House for leaders such as Erdogan. There's a respect for him as a person and to Putin. And sometimes these appreciations for the personalities involved do not maybe go side to side with U.S. interests.
Listen, Erdogan was at one point Obama's best foreign friend.
Yeah.
That relationship soured because
Short term.
Erdogan,
Short term.
overstepped his bounds. He may well do that with Trump. People don't tend to last too
Yeah.
long in Trump's
Buying
good graces.
S-400 would have been that
Yeah.
step, I think, but it didn't.
Yeah, but he wasn't really punished.
No,
Yet.
he wasn't because,
Yet.
because Trump didn't see it as in the United States' interest to start another conflict. That, in one sense, that's unfortunate, but it also makes sense in another point.
I'll just give you the example. After the Turks downed the Russian airplane, 2016, the Russian response was so harsh. Erdogan came back begging for Putin to be friends again. I think there's a terrible sentence about who understands strength. I think everybody understands only strength and power.
I want to say in regard to Turkey, just a couple of points. I mean, Turkey's, first let me say the following. The bottom line is the following, I think. Recep Tayyip Erdogan is, I think, a historic figure, not in the positive sense. I think Recep Tayyip Erdogan is in the business of dismantling the Republic of Turkey as created by Mustafa Kemal nearly 100 years ago now, and creating it with something new, which we can call maybe Islamic Republic of Turkey. Not like Islamic Republic of Iran, something very different, but an Islamic Republic of Turkey. And this has, of course, internal implications, and Erdogan has already finished off most of his internal potential opponents, whether it was the judiciary or the army, the media, the universities, and latterly also the Gulen movement, his allies in his rise to power. And it has implications externally. Externally, by contrast to internally, Erdogan's record is of somebody who is extremely ambitious, but also extremely clumsy. He gets himself into all kinds of strange situations overseas, and then he gets himself into trouble. And if we look at Idlib province now, where he's put in, there's 6,500 Turkish soldiers in Idlib right now. There's over 100 armored vehicles. He's delivered an ultimatum to Bashar Assad's forces that unless they withdraw back to the pre-January 20th positions by the end of February, the Turks will take actions to force them to do so. But exactly as Micky said, Erdogan in no way conceivably can afford to go to war against the will of Vladimir Putin. He can't start operating in Idlib province when the Russians have air domination and the Russians are telling him, don't even think about it. Of course he could the Turkish army could destroy Bashar Assad's army fairly rapidly. But with the Russians standing behind them, forget it. So he's climbed up this tree very high in Idlib, and now he has to start climbing down it without looking too ridiculous as he does so. And I note that this morning, Çavuşoğlu, the foreign minister, for the first time started talking about a new ceasefire in Idlib. This is after Bashar has already rolled up half of Idlib, but nothing, and 800,000 refugees are on the move towards the border. So it looks like Turkey will almost certainly have to settle in the end for a new and humiliating ceasefire in Idlib province, which of course the regime and the Russians will then violate a few months from now to finish off the job. That's where it's heading. So Erdogan's record on foreign policy is of ambition, but great clumsiness. Here in Israel, we take into account a number of very important elements. Firstly, there is good evidence now, concrete evidence now, that active Hamas cells have been active operating from Turkish soil with the knowledge of the government. That's to say, this is something even close to an act of aggression. And this is real, and you can check it, firstly. Secondly, the very aggressive Turkish behavior in the Eastern Mediterranean, in the emergent new strategic arena of the Eastern Mediterranean, pits Turkey, on the one hand, against an emergent alliance of Israel, Greece, and Cyprus on the other, and that's going to be something we're going to be hearing a great deal more about. And at the end of last year, there was an incident already in which Turkish Navy ships quite aggressively forced an Israeli research vessel outside of Cypriot waters, which the Turks don't recognize. So that's the first swallow announced in the spring, if I can use a fairly tortured metaphor, yeah? The spring being an emergent strategic contest between Israel and Turkey in the Eastern Mediterranean. The Turkish ambition in Libya is a part of that, because of course by backing Serraj down in Tripoli, the Turks can then fairly or unfairly claim to be dividing up Mediterranean waters between the Turkish interest and the Libyan interest in such a way that it cuts directly across Israeli and Greek and Cypriot ambitions to build the East Med pipeline, which could be supplying 10% of Europe's gas needs by 2025 if things work out. So there's a direct collision course taking place in the Eastern Mediterranean between a very ambitious but very clumsy Turkish ruler and ourselves and our allies. More broadly, there is a Turkish ambition sticking its fingers here, there, and everywhere across the region, often getting itself into a huge mess, but certainly, being a very potent player that nobody can afford to ignore.
I'm just looking at the time. This will be our last question.
Well, actually a question and a half.
Okay.
Dan Mariash and B'nai B'rith. One lesser but important player that hasn't come up in the conversation this afternoon are the Kurds. And be interested, question to everyone, be interested in how you see the next move for the Kurds in terms of the entire situation, the change in Syria in terms of the president's announcement of withdrawal, the question of Turkey, your comments on that. The second relates to Iran and its march through Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon to the sea. Much has been said, and some of us have been very supportive of the Israeli-Greek Cypriot alignment, or the 3+1 alignment, perhaps bringing in Jordan and bringing in Egypt. Now that Iran is at the sea, what does that mean in terms of threats to that alignment, which seems to be getting stronger and getting more important? Is there any impact on what the Iranians are going to do next on that arrangement?
Maybe I'll start then just by saying, with regard to the Kurds, we have to consider, of course, the Kurds in three different contexts. Let's, since we're short of time, not talk about Iranian Kurds, which is maybe not the least immediately urgent. But with regard to Syria and with regard to Iraq, let me say the following. The Syrian Kurds have now begun a process of Russian-mediated negotiations with the regime in Damascus. And frankly, for as long as the sense continues to grow that the United States' presence in eastern Syria, let's say, is not forever, so the impetus on the Kurds to begin negotiations with Damascus about future arrangements will only grow. And I think it is set to grow for as long as that sense is there that the Americans are only there temporarily. I don't think that sense is going to change. I personally wish it would change. I don't think it will. So the impetus now on the Syrian Kurdish leadership is towards an accommodation as best they can with the regime via the Russians. For as long as America is there, however, in my view, that negotiation will not be concluded, right? Because the Kurds will continue to ask for things which the regime won't be willing to grasp, a measure of continued autonomy, a measure of continued self-rule. So the Americans remain the key factor here. For as long as America is there, the Kurdish autonomy east of the Euphrates will continue to exist one way or another. They'll be talking to the regime to make sure the regime aren't too angry with them while trying to carry on existing. And as soon as the Americans leave, they'll have to surrender very quickly. So America is the key point with regard to the Syrian Kurds. Let me say in this regard, I was in that area in November, and interestingly, on the ground, very little has changed. On the ground, the Kurdish Authority, the Syrian Democratic Council, is still absolutely in control. But its political future is deeply precarious, and it all depends on the United States in this regard. With regard to the Iraqi Kurds, let me say that the instability in government in Baghdad is impacting also on the Kurds as well, because they don't have an agreement right now for the West in the Iraqi context than the Iraqi Kurds, and that's something which cannot be overstated. Just lastly, with regard to Iran reaching the sea and so on, well, look, the Iranians would like, of course, very much to build a base on the Mediterranean. It's likely that the Russians won't permit that with regard to Latakia province in Syria. That's a Russian concern. I think the Russians will be smart enough to prevent that. But let me just note the following final thought to put in people's minds. As East Mediterranean gas continues to be developed, as Israel develops the Leviathan field, there will be no more possible a prestige target for Hezbollah to target, than to have a picture on the world news of Leviathan plant burning in the Mediterranean as a result of Hezbollah action. So the issue of, from an Israeli security point of view, how to prevent that and what that will mean in terms of investing in naval power in a way which Israel has not generally needed to do in the past is a very, very important question facing Israeli strategists and policymakers looking ahead.
I would say with respect to the Kurds, I think Jonathan's entirely right. A Kurdish independent state would be a natural U.S. ally, a counterforce to Iran. There's a lot of good that would come from that, and I've written as much. However, as a political analyst rather than as a strategic analyst like my colleagues here, I have to also say I cannot imagine, as righteous a cause as that may be, I cannot imagine an administration of either political party in the United States ever committing U.S. forces to sustain Kurdish independence. If Kurdistan is to become an independent state, it will have to do it somehow on its own and not with the direct military aid of the United States. I think that is a given, no matter whether it's Trump in the White House next year or Bernie Sanders or anybody in between. That is not going to happen. So that's a conundrum because, as I said, it would be a good thing for the United States in many ways, but the costs are frankly higher, the political costs are higher than any imaginable administration would be willing to pay, as far as I'm concerned.
To follow what was said here, with the regular logic, if the U.S. is
the
now...
Pentagon has gone through it, but in terms of the decision-making process about what to do about it, I think sort of at the top level of the United States sees these attacks as however awful they are, however impressive they are, that they're pinpricks, that they are an attempt to sort of take the U.S.'s eye off the ball, to get it involved in a conflict in which the United States not only doesn't want to be involved, but which would sort of harm its goal of forcing Iran to renegotiate, to put pressure on Iran by economic means. And it doesn't want to do that.